The night was thick with silence, save for the gentle creaking of timber beams and the distant rustle of rats scurrying through the narrow alleys. London, a sprawling maze of wooden houses, crooked lanes, and crowded markets, slumbered under a heavy, humid sky. The air smelled faintly of smoke, as it often did, but few took notice. After all, fire was a part of daily life. The hearths burned through the night, the bakers prepared their ovens for the morning bread, and the city, as always, trusted in its fragile luck. But luck, as Londoners would soon learn, is a fickle and fleeting thing. It was the early hours of Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, when disaster crept quietly into the heart of the city, unseen, unstoppable, and merciless. From a single spark in a modest bakery on Pudding Lane, a nightmare would be unleashed. A nightmare that would consume homes, livelihoods, and lives. A nightmare that would etch itself into the bones of history. This is the story of the Great Fire of London, a city engulfed by flames. Thomas Farriner wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting into the angry glow of his bakery ovens. It had been a long day. The orders for bread were endless, the demands of the city never ceasing. Even in the dead of night, the bakery needed tending. The heat inside the small timber building was stifling, almost unbearable, but it was the lifeblood of his trade. He checked the loaves one last time, stoked the coals, and yawned, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders. Satisfied, he banked the embers, as he had done countless nights before. He climbed the creaking stairs to his sleeping quarters above, never imagining that a single ember, still smoldering in the dark, would soon become an inferno. Outside, the wind picked up, a dry, restless wind that would soon become the fire's cruel ally. It whispered through the cracks in the wood, it stirred the dust in the streets. It waited. And when Thomas Farriner closed his eyes and drifted into uneasy sleep, the first tongue of flame slipped from the oven, licking the timber floor with greedy hunger. Within minutes, the bakery was ablaze, the fire racing up the walls and devouring the dry wood like paper. By the time the Farriner family awoke, their home was an oven. Choking, coughing, they scrambled for escape. Thomas, his daughter, and his servant managed to flee into the street, but their maid, frightened and paralyzed by fear, could not. She would be the Great Fire's first victim. The flames, now unchained, leapt to neighboring houses. In London, houses leaned so close together that a man could stretch out his hand and touch the building across the street. The city was a tinderbox, and now the match had been struck. The bells of St. Magnus the Martyr Church rang out into the smoky morning, their peals frantic, dissonant. Londoners stumbled from their homes, bleary-eyed and confused, clutching children and hastily gathered belongings. At first they thought it was another small fire, a common nuisance. Fires in London were no stranger to the night. But this one was different. The flames moved unnaturally fast, fed by the fierce wind roaring from the east. Fire leapt from rooftop to rooftop, as if the city itself were a pyre built for sacrifice. Sparks, carried like malevolent messengers, found their way into the thatch roofs, into the cracks of dry timber, into the merchant warehouses stacked with barrels of pitch, oil, and spirits. Each new spark birthed another ravenous blaze. Panic began to spread faster than the fire itself. Families fought to gather what little they could carry, silverware, Bibles, precious linens, and fled through narrow, choking alleyways. They looked back only once, to see their homes swallowed whole by flame, disappearing into the seething black smoke that now blanketed the sky. The city was burning, and the people of London could do nothing but run. Word of the fire spread like a contagion, reaching the royal court with alarming speed. King Charles II, just 36 years old, was roused from sleep by a flurry of messengers. He dressed quickly, his face grim, and rode through the city streets at dawn, the smoke thick and suffocating. The king's heart pounded as he witnessed the scale of the disaster unfolding before him. This was no minor incident. This was a catastrophe, and unless swift action was taken, his London would be lost. Accompanied by his brother, the Duke of York, Charles barked orders: demolish houses to create fire breaks, tear down streets if necessary, use gunpowder if you must, anything to stop the fire's advance. But hesitation, confusion, and bureaucracy stalled the response. Property owners balked at the idea of destroying their homes. Officials were slow to act. Precious hours were lost, hours that the fire would use to tighten its grip on the city. The king's command was clear, but was it already too late? Among the crowd that watched London burn was a man whose words would immortalize the horror: Samuel Pepys. A naval administrator by trade, and a diarist by passion, Pepys was both participant and observer, a man who loved his city, and whose detailed accounts would become the voice of a generation lost to flame. Pepys stood atop the Tower of London, gazing over the inferno. He described it in his diary with a mixture of awe and despair. A most horrid, malicious, bloody flame, not like the fine flame of an ordinary fire, but a foul black and red flame. He watched as entire streets vanished into a storm of embers. He saw the grand St. Paul's Cathedral, thought to be impervious, its ancient stones cracking and exploding under the heat. He recorded the wails of the homeless, the endless procession of refugees pouring out of the city gates, dragging carts laden with all they owned. He noted how Londoners set up makeshift camps in the fields outside the walls, stunned, weeping, lost. Samuel Pepys became the city's reluctant chronicler, capturing not just the destruction of London's buildings, but the unraveling of its very soul. For 3 days and 3 nights, Londoners fled before the fire like animals before a storm. The River Thames became a highway of desperation, crowded with boats overloaded with families, furniture, livestock, anything that could be saved. The roads were choked with carts and wagons, prices for transport skyrocketed. Desperation drove men to violence, to theft. Mothers clutched infants to their chests. Elderly men stumbled and fell, unable to keep pace. Dogs howled and horses screamed as smoke blackened the sky and day turned to night. In the fields beyond the city, survivors huddled together under makeshift tents of cloth and branches. They looked back at London, once the heart of England's glory, now a smoldering, unrecognizable ruin. Rumors ran wild. Some claimed it was a Catholic plot, an act of sabotage. Others blamed the Dutch or the French. Fear and suspicion fermented in the open air as surely as the flames consumed the city walls. The fire burned not just wood and stone. It burned trust. It burned community. It burned the fragile thread of normalcy that had once held London together. At the center of the city stood the majestic St. Paul's Cathedral, a symbol of London's strength and faith. Built of stone, it was thought to be invincible. But the flames were indiscriminate. On the evening of September 4th, the fire reached St. Paul's. The cathedral had been undergoing repairs, and wooden scaffolding wrapped its ancient walls like a funeral shroud. The fire found it eagerly, climbing higher and higher until the great spire itself was engulfed. Witnesses described a terrible roar as the lead roof melted and poured down the sides of the building like a river of fire. Massive stones exploded outward with deafening blasts. The cathedral, which had stood for over 5 centuries, collapsed in a storm of smoke, ash, and sorrow. It was as if London's very heart had been torn from its chest. By September 6th, the fire had spent itself, not because of human efforts, but because the wind, at last, had died down. The smoldering ruins of London stretched as far as the eye could see. 4/5 of the city was gone. Over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, countless shops, inns, and businesses reduced to blackened skeletons. Thousands of Londoners were left homeless, destitute, with nothing but the clothes they wore. The air was still heavy with the scent of smoke, a grim reminder of all that had been lost. Ash fell like snow upon the rubble. Londoners wandered through the ruins in silence, the magnitude of their grief too large for words. But amidst the ruin, seeds of hope began to stir. King Charles II vowed to rebuild. He called for bold new plans, wider streets, brick and stone buildings, greater fire safety. Christopher Wren, the brilliant architect, was commissioned to design a new London, including a new St. Paul's Cathedral, grander and more magnificent than before. The people, too, began to rebuild their lives. Bricklayers, carpenters, masons flooded into the city. Markets reopened amid the ashes. Children played among the ruins. Life, stubborn and unyielding, pressed forward. London would rise again, not immediately, not without pain, but inevitably. The fire had destroyed the city, but it had not destroyed the spirit of its people. The Great Fire of London was a tragedy, but it was also a beginning. A phoenix born from flame and ruin. The Great Fire remains a defining moment in London's history, a cautionary tale of complacency and carelessness, but also a testament to resilience. The city that emerged from the ashes would become one of the greatest in the world, cleaner, stronger, and wiser. Even today, the streets whisper the memory of those terrible days in September 1666. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the crackle of the flames, the tolling of the bells, the heartbeat of a city that refused to die. London burned, London fell, but London endured.